Wow. This deep dive request you sent in, it's really got us intrigued.
Yeah.
Looks like a whole mountain of info about this SRC case, the one with Najib Razak, the
Yeah.
former PM of Malaysia.
Right.
And whoa, allegations of corruption, talk of political shenanigans, and just a ton of questions about, did he really get a fair trial? It's a real mess, that's for sure.
It is.
But hey, we're here to help you sort through it all, so.
Absolutely. And I think what's really fascinating here is it's not just about some financial scandal.
Right.
Your sources, especially like the leaked documents and analyses, they suggest there might be something, systemically wrong within Malaysia's legal system, like the system itself.
Yeah, it's like you open up this door and there's a whole nother world back there.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking 42 million ringgit. But then it spirals out there, like government guarantees, cabinet ministers, Joe Hull, who was, a major player in the 1MDB whole thing. I mean, where do we even begin with all this?
Yeah, I think a good place to start is with the SRC case itself. So SRC International, it was a subsidiary of 1MDB, that Malaysian state investment fund, the one that, ended up making headlines for all the wrong reasons.
Right.
And the main accusation is that Najib, who at the time was both prime minister and finance minister, used his power to get those government guarantees approved for loans to SRC.
Okay, so let me just make sure I'm following this. Are we saying that the government was basically backing these loans?
Exactly.
Meaning, like, if SRC couldn't pay up, taxpayers were going to be stuck with the bill.
That's it. And the prosecution, they claim this was all a scheme for Najib to, line his own pockets.
Okay.
They're alleging 42 million ringgit from SRC went straight into his personal bank accounts, which led to those charges, breach of trust, money laundering, all that.
Gotcha. But the documents you sent, they paint a completely different picture.
Yeah.
It's almost like looking at the same event through two different, sets of glasses or something.
That's a great way to put it. So the defense, their argument is that Najib, he didn't actually get any personal gain from that money.
Yeah.
Their claim is that those 42 million ringgit, it was part of a much bigger, like a corporate social responsibility initiative,
Right.
basically for stuff like charity projects, community development. And to back that up, they point to these leaked documents.
Okay.
They're from the SPRM, the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission.
Got it.
And these documents, they suggest the money didn't come directly from SRC.
Right.
Instead, it originated from a loan by Maybank to a company called Putrajaya Perdana.
Wait, hold on, Maybank. Wasn't there something about the judge in Najib's case having, a connection to Maybank?
That's one of the red flags that these sources bring up.
Okay.
So yeah, turns out the judge had actually worked for Maybank before, which, of course, raises questions about, a possible conflict of interest.
Right. And then it gets even more complicated when you look at the cabinet minister, the one who first suggested those government guarantees for SRC.
Okay.
Turns out, later on, it came out that he'd received funds from J-Ho Lo, the guy, the alleged mastermind behind that whole 1MDB mess.
And no one thought to investigate this minister. It seems like there might have been some selective focus going on here.
That's exactly the point a lot of these sources are making.
Yeah.
They're not just questioning the evidence in the case,
Yeah.
They're saying, hey, there's this whole pattern of actions here, and it casts doubt on whether the whole process was even fair. In fact, they point to 8 specific things, 8 factors that suggest the justice system might have been, manipulated.
Okay, so we've gone from allegations of corruption to what could be a much bigger problem, like some systemic issues going on. So tell me more about these 8 factors. What are we talking about here?
Sure. So first thing they point out is the removal of the attorney general at the time.
He was replaced by, get this, a private lawyer, and this lawyer had really close ties to the ruling party. And then, not long after that, the Chief Justice, he's forced to resign. And guess who gets appointed as the new Chief Justice?
I'm guessing someone who was favorable to them.
Exactly. The very person this new Attorney General had suggested, according to his own autobiography.
That's incredibly convenient timing, to say the least.
Right. And then there's the fact that Najib, he was repeatedly denied the right to present new evidence, stuff that could have actually helped his defense.
Wow.
Oh, and get this. The judge who ended up on Najib's case had less than a year of experience on the bench and absolutely no background in criminal cases.
Really?
Yeah, he was suddenly moved from civil court to handle this huge high-profile trial and then just as conveniently transferred right back to civil court once it was all over.
So not only was he inexperienced for this kind of case, but it sounds like he was also basically handpicked for it. I mean, is that even allowed?
According to the sources, 3 other judges, they refused to take the case before this particular judge said yes.
Wow.
It definitely makes you wonder, was there some attempt to, control the outcome from the get-go?
Yeah, this is getting more and more concerning. What were some of the other factors that, raise these red flags?
Okay, well, for one, Najib's defense lawyer wasn't allowed to withdraw from the case, even though he wanted to.
Really?
Yeah, he was basically forced to just sit there quietly while the prosecution made their arguments. So in the end, Najib was sent to prison without his defense team even getting a chance to present their case.
That seems like a serious violation of, the whole idea of due process. What else? What else?
No, there's also the fact that the judge's verdict, it was leaked to the media before the prosecution had even finished presenting their side.
Oh, come on.
I know, right? And finally, remember those leaked SPRM documents we talked about? The ones that basically contradicted the entire story about where the funds came from? Well, those only came out after Najib was already convicted and in prison.
So it sounds like not only was the case itself potentially built on, shaky ground, but there might have been key evidence that was either ignored or maybe even purposely kept hidden. I mean, this is pretty shocking stuff.
It definitely paints a very different picture than that simple story of corruption that was presented at first.
Yeah. So we've got this whole backdrop of possible manipulation of the system, but then there's also those contradictions you mentioned before. We haven't even gotten into those yet, have we?
You're right, we haven't. And there are some pretty big inconsistencies that, well, they warrant a closer look, I think.
Okay.
Like, for instance, Najib was accused of misappropriating 42 million ringgit.
Right.
Which, I mean, that's a lot of money, no doubt.
Yeah.
But he had previously received 642 million ringgit, totally legally, from sources in Saudi Arabia.
Wait, so hold on. He's accused of, stealing this relatively small amount when he already had access to way more.
Yeah.
And that bigger sum, if I'm remembering right, was for legitimate stuff.
It was.
Corporate social responsibility, things like that. Something doesn't add up here.
That's exactly the point a lot of these sources are bringing up.
Yeah.
It does seem, well, kind of illogical.
Yeah.
That someone would, go through all this risky financial stuff for a smaller amount when they've already got a much bigger pool of money they can use legally.
It's like accusing someone of stealing $1 when they've got a $100 bill right there in their wallet.
Yeah, a perfect analogy.
Okay.
And to make it even more confusing, there's no direct evidence linking Najib to, any specific instructions or requests about transferring those 42 million ringgit to his account.
So let me see if I've got this right. The judge basically convicted him on the assumption that because he was the prime minister and finance minister and an advisor to SRC, he must have been behind it all.
That seems to be the main argument, the one that these sources are putting forward. They're saying the judge's decision, it relied way too much on assumptions and circumstantial evidence rather than, actual solid proof that Najib was directly involved in any wrongdoing.
Okay, so we've got this case. It's full of potential conflicts of interest, allegations of the system being manipulated, and now these contradictions that just don't make sense. What does all this mean for Najib's future? Is there any chance he could actually overturn this conviction?
Well, his legal team, they're definitely fighting hard. They're appealing the conviction and bringing up all these issues.
Right.
It's going to be really interesting to see what the higher courts do with this case, especially now that those leaked SPRM documents are out there. They could totally change things for the appeal.
Yeah, for sure. So, zooming out a bit, what do these sources tell us about the bigger picture here? About, the Malaysian legal system overall?
That's the really important question, isn't it?
Yeah.
If these allegations about manipulation and lack of due process, if they turn out to be true, it raises some serious concerns about the integrity and fairness of the justice system in Malaysia.
Yeah.
It suggests that, political stuff could be influencing legal proceedings, which, well, that has implications for, the very foundation of the rule of law.
That's a sobering thought. I mean, if someone as powerful as a former prime minister can potentially be treated like this, what does that say about the average person's chances of getting a fair hearing?
That's a question worth thinking about. This case, it goes beyond Najib Razak and what happened to him. It's about those basic principles of justice and accountability, in a democratic society.
So after taking this deep dive into this case and how complicated it is, What are the, like, main takeaways you're hoping our listener walks away with?
I think the most important thing is this story, it's not black and white. Not at all. We've looked at what the prosecution said, but we've also seen some strong arguments from the defense backed up by those outside sources that challenge that narrative. And they cast some serious doubt on whether Najib's conviction was even valid.
It's a classic example of why it's so important to get different perspectives before you form an opinion.
Exactly. You got to look at all the evidence, weigh the arguments from both sides, and then come to your own conclusions.
And it also underlines how important it is to be, like, a smart consumer of information,
Yeah.
especially with cases like this that are so complex and, well, potentially political.
Absolutely. Don't just accept what you're told, at face value.
Right.
Dig deeper, ask questions, and be critical of what you see and hear. And remember, this case, it's still unfolding.
Yeah.
There are appeals happening, new evidence could come out. The legal fight, it's far from over.
Okay, so bringing this back to the reason our listener wanted this deep dive. What can we say for sure about those allegations against Najib, the evidence, and whether the legal process was fair?
Well, based on what you've shared, those allegations against Najib, they're definitely not clear-cut. The prosecution, they presented this story of blatant abuse of power and him trying to get rich. But the defense, with those leaked documents backing them up, suggests a whole different story. One about political maneuvering and maybe even a miscarriage of justice.
It's wild how two totally opposite interpretations can come from the same set of facts. It really shows you how subjective perception can be.
That's a really good point. And when you add in those potential conflicts of interest, the judge's background, the fact that he was inexperienced in criminal cases, the denial of due process, and then that potentially exculpatory evidence popping up after the conviction, well, you can't ignore those concerns about the fairness of the whole thing.
So where does all this leave us? What's the bottom line for our listener who's trying to make sense of all this information?
I think the big takeaway is this case, it's far from over. And there's a lot more to uncover. It reminds us that justice isn't always, straightforward or simple.
Right.
It often needs constant scrutiny, investigation, and a willingness to, challenge what we think we know. This SRC case, with all its twists and turns, it shows us how fragile justice can be and how important it is to constantly be on guard to protect it.
It's a reminder that we all have a part to play in holding our institutions accountable and making sure that seeking justice stays a core part of our society. And on that note, I think it's time for that final thought-provoking question you mentioned.
Okay, so let's say we accept those leaked SPRM documents as accurate, meaning that 42 million ringgit, it didn't actually come from SRC like the prosecution said.
Right.
What does that tell us about how strong their case against Najib really was? And maybe even more importantly, what does it mean for the future of the Malaysian legal system and whether people can trust it to deliver justice that's truly impartial?
That's a question that really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like maybe the whole story around this case, it wasn't just what happened in the courtroom.
Yeah. It definitely shows how important investigative journalism and whistleblowers are, to hold those in power accountable and make sure justice is really being served. Without that information, stuff that challenges the official story, it's tough for people to form their own opinions, based on facts.
It's like they say, sunlight's the best disinfectant.
Exactly. Transparency is key, especially with these cases involving high-level officials and accusations of corruption. The more we know, the better we can, have real conversations and demand accountability.
This whole deep dive has really shown how important critical thinking is.
Yeah.
We got to approach information with, like, a healthy dose of skepticism.
Yeah.
We can't just take everything at face value, especially when things are complicated and, well, potentially political like this.
I totally agree. It's so important to be able to, break down information, spot those potential biases, and consider different points of view. Being able to think critically, that's crucial for navigating the world of information these days.
So after this deep dive into the SRC case and all the questions it raises about Malaysia's legal system, is there, a final thought you want to leave our listener with? Something to, chew on as they keep exploring this whole thing, which is still developing, by the way.
Yeah, I think the main thing to remember is justice, it's a process. It's not always neat and tidy, and it often takes a lot of scrutiny, investigation, and, a willingness to challenge what we think we know. The SRC case, with all its craziness, it shows us how fragile justice is and how important it is to protect it, to be vigilant,
It reminds us that we all have a role to play in holding our institutions accountable and in making sure the pursuit of justice is, like, a fundamental part of our society. And on that note, We encourage you, our listener, to keep digging into this case. Don't stop asking questions, keep searching for information, and keep talking about these important issues. Because at the end of the day, a well-informed and engaged public, that's the strongest defense against injustice.